So thanks so much for having me. As Maha mentioned, today I'm kind of presenting work that's at the intersection of open source, but also Gen AI. And we're trying to use open source as a setting to think about how generative AI affects the nature of work. And this is joint work with two postdocs in my lab, Manuel, who I believe is on the call, and then also Sam. And then also we're using lots of open source data is public, but we've partnered with this to get some proprietary behind the scenes data. I'll talk about that in a minute. And so Sita Peng from Microsoft and Kevin Zhu from GitHub have helped a bunch with this paper as well. So just a brief overview of my research agenda. I think Maha already hit some of the highlights, but the way I think about what I study is indeed from a strategic lens. We're always thinking about creating and capturing value, and so that's how I think about the work that I do with open source. And so I have a smaller set of work on creating how open source creates value for the world, essentially, and then the bulk of my work is thinking about capturing value from open source and usually how firms capture value from open source, but also in this context that we're talking about today, thinking about how individuals can capture value from engaging with open source, but also using AI in that context. So I think I may have to readjust this slide because I think more of my work is shifting to AI, but in the open source context, and so I may need to add another bucket here. So today we'll be thinking about Gen AI and the nature of work. I think Gen AI at this point I probably don't have to explain, but if you put the title of this paper into DALL-E, which is OpenAI's image generator, this is what it thinks Gen AI and the nature of work looks like. Obviously, that sums it up pretty nicely. So thinking about how AI and humans interact and how it changes the way that humans work, right? And so very broadly, that's the goal of this study, is thinking about how AI changes the nature of work. But more narrowly, in the empirical side, we look at how AI may or may not change the task allocation for open source software production. I'll talk about what we mean by task allocation in a minute, but really thinking about how people used to work and how they work now once they have a Gen AI tool in this setting. And I should have mentioned at the top, I know sometimes the seminar holds questions to the end, but please feel free to raise your hands. If you see me looking this way, it's my other monitor, and so I'll keep an eye out for people raising hands. Also, feel free to just jump in if I don't see your hand. Jiho, there we go.
Oh, hi, Frank. I just wondered so it's just for clarification. So here, task allocation means like within individual allocation of
Yes.
task, not the like division of labor like at the organizational level, right?
Yes. So
Okay.
actually, yes, with this paper, it's within person. However, we're actually an extension of this. We're only started to scratch the surface, but we're going to look across teams as well and see if there's specialization or those types of things. But think of today's talk is within person and how an individual shifts the work that they do. So great question.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. So just a quick overview in case anybody has to leave early. So, the context here, we look at the weekly level activity for over the course of 2 years for open source maintainers. I know, Maha organizes this seminar, and so there's been a bunch of open source speakers, but I'll, give a brief overview of open source in a minute. But just in case you're unfamiliar with open source maintainers, they're the ones who are sort of the managers of the projects and have the rights to commit or to edit the code base. And so think of them as kind of the managers in open source land. And so we'll be looking at them and their weekly levels of activity over the course of 2 years. We have this nice natural experiment where there's a discontinuity in GitHub's. GitHub has this program where they decide to offer free coding Gen AI. So this is Copilot, which now Microsoft has kind of taken the name Copilot, and it's everything to do with AI. And Microsoft is called Copilot, but it originated within GitHub as this free they rolled out a version that's free to people that were considered top maintainers. So think about this as a pretty standard regression discontinuity where there was a cutoff, and those above the cutoff got free access to Copilot. Copilot, and those below the cutoff didn't. And so we'll use that as for our identification to compare the folks that are just above to those that are just below across a couple of different buckets through which they offered this free access. The main results along this task reallocation line is that we see that those who get access to Copilot or who are eligible for it, they increase the amount of core work they do proportionally, and they decrease the amount of project management they do. So, which is interesting because the tool itself isn't really there to help with project management; it's there to help with code. And we'll think about and kind of hypothesize about why this relationship is likely to play out this way. But that's the main kind of result. Consistent with some other studies of AI, we see that the impact is stronger for those with lower ability. We'll talk about how we measure that. We do it in a couple different ways, and it's all pretty consistent. And then we dig into this a little bit deeper to try to understand the primary mechanisms that are at play that are driving this relationship. And what we predict and show is that that the tool allows people to work more autonomously. So don't think about that as like AI driven. Think about that as autonomous as in by yourself. So they do more work by themselves and less collaborative work with other people, which is interesting in its own right because open source is generally seen as a very collaborative space. And so we can, if there's time at the end, we can debate whether this is a good thing or a bad thing in open source. I think generally we see this as a good thing, but it does decrease some of the collaboration that these the collaborative activity these folks have done in the past. They become less collaborative in the future. And then the other thing that's driving this as well is we see more exploration. Exploration versus exploitation is a classic dichotomy in management literature. And so we'll all talk about how we operationalize this, but we see people doing more new things and more experimentation and things like that, and less of the things that they've been doing in the past, right? And so the tool allows them to do this, and this is what leads to that shift in core work versus project management. Maha?
Quick clarification on what you mean by collaborative. I mean, if you're going to explain it later, that's fine. Reason being, the why I'm asking is that we also know from past studies that collaboration, especially if you look at the Crouston and House and work, that we're superpositioning that actually they don't really like working in teams. They sort of work individually. So I'm just trying to understand what you mean by collaborative here.
Sure. So think of it as, if you used to be working on projects that had like lots of people, now you're working on projects that are just you, right? And so agree that, what collaborative means is a little fuzzy in open source land, right? Yes, you may be working on a project that has other people, but like you may be doing it sort of solo still. I'll get even more into the details of that, but just think of it as you're working on projects that have fewer people on them, right? And you're engaging, and there's actually a couple other dimensions that we measure on that as well, and they're all fairly consistent. That it's you're doing more stuff by yourself and less stuff with other people on a couple of different dimensions. So yeah, but I'll dig into that in just a moment. Great. So how we think about the contribution of this is there's been lots of there's been, especially this is all only in the past few years, but good research on thinking about how Gen AI is used and applicable in many areas, and there's been a little bit of work on this already in open source. We're tackling a different dimension here, so this is kind of the existing literature. What we aim to contribute here beyond what's already out there is that we try to move again beyond just productivity effects. There's lots of good studies on how Gen AI and other things increase productivity, and we're really trying to get it at the next level and think about the nature of work itself. And so yes, okay, we improve productivity, that's good, that's important, but how does it actually change how people think about work and spend their time at work? And then we also, there's this long literature in economics, but also in management, thinking about the private provision of public goods. And here, obviously, open source is a public good. And so we're trying to think about how I'll talk about this more broadly, but there's been concerns about the open source ecosystem where, fewer people are as active as they used to be and all these types of things. And so our hope is that, this type of work shows that there's ways that we can help open source maintainers, reduce burnout and other things like that. And so that's kind of a knock-on effect of this. And then lastly, a lot of these studies are more kind of short-term and also some of them are lab-based. And so the goal here is to provide this long-term causal evidence over the course of a couple of years from what was a real-world scenario. This was very much a natural experiment RDD type of design. GitHub did it themselves, and then we came in later to look at what happened. So just to kind of think about this core work versus management dichotomy, right? We can think about in our own lives as information workers, right? As academics, if we do well at research and teaching, that's our core work. Then we get more administrative assignments, right? And so we get promoted, and we have to do more. Yeah, Maha's nodding; she knows about this, right? And so this is, it turns out that this is the case in lots of contexts, especially in information type jobs, right? The better you are your core work, the more managerial work you're given. And that's, the same for our context in programmers, right? And so, we think about this in the context of programmers, core work being coding and actually writing code and cleaning up code and these types of things. And project management being more, I'll show you, exactly what we define it, but, things about, documentation and managing inbound requests and working with others and things like that. And so, there was a study that we did a number of years ago on open source contributors. We ran a big survey of open source contributors. And one of the findings that came out of that was that many folks in this world who are, especially the volunteers doing this, out of the goodness of their heart, or just they like doing it, they end up spending way more time than they want to on project management and way less time than they want to on coding, right? And so the hope here is that, if as we will see that the Gen AI tool allows them to spend more time on what they want to spend time on it and less time on what they don't want to spend time on, that may actually be a good thing, because it may reduce, maintainer burnout and people, and may help the open source ecosystem writ large. So, we have a pretty straightforward model on thinking about how Gen AI can reduce the cost of work. And so, essentially what happens here is, an individual is trying to maximize their utility based on core work and management and the balance of that. And each of those has a price associated with them, right? There's a certain cost to doing core work. There's a certain cost to doing managerial work. And the way that Gen AI enters here is that it's going to reduce the cost of doing that core work, right? So it's going to make coding cheaper, essentially, because now, instead, and I'll show how the tool works in just a minute for those of you not familiar with it, but it just makes it faster to code. It makes it cheaper to code. You can write more code in a shorter amount of time. And so then, when we think about how that's gonna play out in the kind of effect on this balance of work, we expect core work to go up, because when other studies have shown other types of IT, when they reduce the cost of a task, workers end up doing more of it, right? So a lot of this is from the IS literature that has shown IT and IS help. When it reduces the cost, we do more of that thing. And then on the flip side, it's less clear exactly what's going to happen on project management, because it's sort of dependent on this variable that I'm sorry, I need more caffeine for a second. The elasticity of substitution. There we go. That's what I was thinking of, right? So it depends on the individual's kind of preferences. And so we think about, management being a less routine task. And so automation won't always impact it directly, right? And so when we think about, the effect on kind of the total amount of work being done here, we expect core work to go up, but project management is less clear. And so when we think about the relative amount as well, it's a little bit less clear, and sort of depends more on the individual. And so, when we think about, I mentioned the mechanisms behind this, we kind of extend the model in, again, sort of a simple method for a nested CES. But we think about two types of core and managerial work instead of one, right? So we can think about, core work can be more autonomous and more collaborative, and also managerial work could be more autonomous or more collaborative, right? And so we think about some context-specific assumptions and presume, and I think this gets to what Maha was pointing out before, that there are some collaborative frictions that are common in these distributed types of work, right? Like, it's not super simple to work with other people from around the world. Tools like GitHub and many other things have made that easier, but it's not, but there are some frictions there, right? And so when you have that type of friction, what we're predicting is going to happen is that even though the tech, kind of helps streamline communication and decision making and reduces some of this collaborative overhead, what ends up happening is this frees the workers to work more in isolation, right? So this is in line with what Maha was pointing out before. That's kind of already sort of there in the background of open source, but it's going to impact that or exacerbate that even more, right? So we'll see people more working by themselves and less working with others, both on core and managerial type of work. And then we can use that same type of model, but also thinking about a different dichotomy, this exploration versus exploitation, again, with some very basic and kind of rational assumptions. It's often in this type of distributed work, it's easier to start a new project than it is to contribute to something like Linux, where there's all this tech debt and complications and it's very complex type of thing. And so with that sort of basic assumption, with the introduction of Gen AI, we're going to expect to see more an increase in exploration, so sort of experimentation and starting new projects and things like that. We measure this in a couple of ways, and a reduction in exploitation, so less work on the kind of big existing projects that you've been working on before. But interestingly, and I'm kind of jumping ahead and getting ahead of myself, but even thinking about the programming languages that people use, we see, after the introduction of Gen AI, we see an increase in people trying out new languages that they've never programmed in before, and a decrease in their time spent on languages that they have done before. So on many dimensions, we see this kind of exploration increase and exploitation decrease. And then lastly, I mentioned ability, which in this space, it's interesting. I just saw a paper the other day that was looking at the introduction of not Gen AI, it was pre-Gen AI, but an AI that it's from a PhD student at MIT, an AI that helps material sciences scientists in kind of come up with ideas for new materials, and there it was the high ability people, the very experienced people that actually got more out of this. But I think what we're seeing is more consistent with many of the results, that actually it's the lower ability folks that are benefiting more, right? So Eric Brynjolfsson and Daniel Lee and Lindsay Raymond just had a paper come out in QJE that was looking at this from a productivity standpoint in the call center space, and they certainly found that the lower ability folks benefited from this more. And our kind of intuition in this space is that we're going to see the main effect be larger in both directions, in both contexts. So coding will likely go up even more, and project management will go down even more for those folks with lower ability. And again, we'll measure ability with a couple of different ways, and it's all fairly consistent. So those are the main four plus hypotheses on how we're thinking about what we're going to see. And so now we'll shift gears into the empirics. Any questions on the hypotheses? We've gone back and forth on this economic model and versus the sort of more verbal theory argumentation, and we ended up kind of in the middle. So that's why we have math and lots of citations both. Bilge?
Hi, Frank. So I wanted to clarify the hypothesis 3. So you say exploitation is going to go down, whereas all these productivity gains, etc., the findings that you mentioned actually are about exploitation. So is it like the mechanism is that the more you delegate routine tasks to AI, you have more kind of leeway for exploring new stuff? That is the argument here. I didn't understand why.
Sure.
The effect goes this way. It feels like the other way around actually is how it works, right?
In programming or in general? When you're thinking the other way.
When you have all these productivity gains from AI, it feels like you're focusing so well on what you do and actually do more exploitation. So you cite Benner and Tushman. I feel like that effect is kind of extrapolated what they found in the process innovation in normal settings. When you use AI, it's kind of extrapolated that you kind of so much focus on exploitation. Their argument was you ignore exploration. I feel like in the AIs, when you incorporate AI into this setup, it makes it even more focused on exploitation. So I was expecting exploitation to actually increase in that sense. So I kind of try to understand what's the mechanism driving exactly this hypothesis.
Interesting. Yeah. So I'll get a bit more into that. You'll see it when we operationalize, when we get into the empirics. But it's a fair question, and it's a reasonable point. I mean, I think, you think about like the other studies that you're alluding to that have studied Gen AI, and they lead into more productive. Yes, they lead to higher productivity, right? But productivity can be many different things, right? So I haven't read the call center paper in a little bit, so I don't know what the final. I've read an earlier version of it, but I don't know what the final version ended up looking like. But one can imagine that there's two ways to think about productivity enhancements for somebody that works in a call center. One is that they are they've only ever worked on a certain type of call, like maybe low level tech support or something like that, types of calls. And so, productivity improvement could be that they do more of those faster, right? But also productivity improvement could be that they start doing a second type of tech support type of call, right? And so they're able to do a broader set of things also in a faster set of time. So I think that's one of the concerns that we've had thinking about the existing studies, is that indeed it's hard to know, like, okay, productivity goes up, but how does it change like what the work is that people are actually doing, right? Because I think many of the other studies are in these narrower types of settings. Not that, I mean, open source and software development is still sort of narrow, but there's more flexibility in ability to kind of explore, right? And so I think, at least the model we have, and again, this does rely on this sort of assumption. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but of the ease of starting new work. And so certainly in distributed work settings like open source, we're gonna the assumption is that it's easier to start something that's by yourself than make substantial contributions to some big existing project that has lots of interdependencies and lots of complexity and things like that. So perhaps in cases where this assumption is not true, right, where we have it's actually easier to it's harder to start new things than to contribute to existing things, then perhaps we might see this reverse. Does that help?
Yeah, I think when I see the probably results will be clear. It's just making me feel all these productivity gains all going towards exploitation thinking. So I mean, it gives the leeway for exploration. I can understand why exploration goes up, but I don't understand why it goes at the other way around equally. Like it's like a zero-sum game kind of. You have now less exploitation suddenly. So
and so let's revisit that when we get to the empirics. But certainly,
sure.
You think about
Thanks.
If I have 40 hours a week and I have to get 7 tasks done, but now AI makes it easier for me to do, or faster to do those 7 tasks, I have still, new time that I can do something else with, right? And so, as opposed to doing more of those same tasks, I think that's the intuition here in this setting, but certainly agreed it could potentially be different in other settings. Good. Great. Excellent. So let's see, there we go. Right. So, so the challenge in testing, there's 2 big challenges in kind of testing these hypotheses, right? So first we have to identify a setting where we can actually see these types of work patterns, right? And actually see how people are allocating their time across tasks, which is not always, trivial. And then secondly, of course, for identification purposes, we need this kind of quasi exogenous introduction of an AI tool that actually has some sort of impact to workers, right? And so our setting of the introduction of GitHub Copilot for these key developers, and I'll talk about how the program rolled out, ends up being able to do that, right? Open source and on GitHub, we can see all the work that they're doing and the way that they're allocating their time or allocating their tasks. And of course, this, as I mentioned, the Copilot release was essentially exogenous because of this kind of arbitrary cutoff that they had. So I'll talk more about that in just a second. Again, I know there's been a few open source folks presented in the seminar series, but just a quick, overview of the open source software process, just so we're on the same page with it. Generally how this works is somebody's going to write a piece of code and upload it to an open source repository or a project folder, and they become the maintainer of the project, right? So they're, in this context, they're the creator. I'll talk about there's another way one can become a maintainer in a second. And so as the maintainer, they can add or edit code to that project directly, right? Now, if you or I want to, contribute to that project, we can do that in a couple of ways. We could report an issue. So we could say, hey, I found this bug. Can you please fix it? Or, this code is great, but can you add this new feature or something like that? So these are what we call issues. And then second, the other way that individuals can contribute is they can actually provide a suggested code request, right? So, I love your project. I think it would be great if we can add this new feature. Here, I've written the code to actually go do that, right? And this is what's called a pull request, right? And so, in general, an external individual doesn't have the right to just edit the code directly. They have to do what's called a pull request, and on the maintainer, they can choose, these managers, they can choose to address those issue requests and those pull requests or not, right? So if I send somebody that's a maintainer a piece of code, it's up to them if they accept that or merge that pull request. You'll hear me use those terms. And same type of thing with the issues. If I report a bug, it's sort of up to the maintainer if they fix it or not. And that's kind of how this process works. And then the last piece of this to think about is that a maintainer can add additional maintainers to a project, right? And so this is how you have, especially like big projects like Linux or Apache or things like that, have lots of maintainers responsible for different pieces of it. And so, it's not only the maintainers are the creators and the founders of a project, they can add other people to that maintainer kind of management level as well, right? So that's kind of the open source in a nutshell. And in particularly, there's lots more intricacy to open source, but these are kind of the important things for what we're looking at here today. And so, many of you may have seen this graphic before, perhaps in this seminar series, but there's this kind of problem in open source that has evolved over time and become a bigger and bigger problem, where you have these small little projects that one person wrote and is just maintaining, but the whole ecosystem ends up being built on top of them, right? And so this is I think you may have heard about the XZ utils attack, where and this is essentially what happened was there was one person who was maintaining a project, and they were getting overwhelmed with requests to edit and add new code and make changes and all these types of things. So they added a maintainer who had been, kind of a little bit involved in making some of these suggestions and things like that. And it actually turned out that person was a malicious actor, right? That second maintainer. And so somebody at Microsoft, and then they put in the code, basically a backdoor and this piece of code was, much like this kind of picture, was this super critical piece that's in like all modern software. And they put a backdoor into it so that essentially they would be able to access any piece of software, on the world, or any system that was using any of these higher level components built on it. And thankfully, some engineer at Microsoft just happened to notice that there was something weird looking in that piece of open source code, and that led to an investigation and the unraveling of this whole story. And this was only last year, right? And so when we think about this kind of linchpin problem, one of the questions is, can we make this burden on the maintainers a bit easier or a bit lower, so that they're able to do the things they want to do and spend less time on the things they don't want to do, and not kind of make ourselves susceptible to these broader concerns of kind of ecosystem health and safety and all the things that we've been worried about for decades with open source. But now that it's so baked into everything that we do in kind of modern computing, it's become all that much more important. Great. So that's open source in a nutshell, and kind of thinking about how this in particular in the open source land may help. So just to give you some background on GitHub, it's become essentially the de facto hub for collaborative open source development or solo open source development, as we alluded to. It was founded in 2008, but really takes off a number of years later. It allows for both. The reason it's become so popular is that you can use it for internal code, right? So you can have private repositories that are for your company, for your personal use, things like that. But you can also host public repositories, which is essentially open source, right? And so it allows for this private provision of public good, which again, economics has told us that's a good thing if we can encourage that. And then for our purposes, it's also important because we get to see this time-stamped history of all the code that's done in a project, right? So we have fairly granular measurement on the coding activity that people do, also the project management they do, as well as kind of the time when these types of things happen. And then we can see a third bucket of kind of other activities that are neither coding nor project management. And so we're able to measure this kind of allocation of tasks across the three buckets. And so back to the earlier discussion, kind of the theoretical side, it's not necessarily mechanical that if coding goes up and project management goes down, because we do have this kind of third bucket of other things. So it's quite feasible that they would both go up when we think about the allocation across these different tasks. Just to give you, some screenshots, if you've never seen GitHub before, this is what a GitHub repository looks like. This is kind of the code piece of it, right? So all these folders have pieces of computer, software code in them. This is XCUtils, the aforementioned one. And then, and these are commits. So we'll measure kind of code activity primarily in commits. And that's when a new piece of code is added to the code base, right? You can also think about commits. They can also be deleting pieces of code, right? So if there were, if there's a more efficient way to write a piece of code, or there was a bug and we had to remove it, a commit is essentially a change to the code base that's approved by a maintainer. When we think about the project management side of this, you can also see this is all within the GitHub kind of place, but you can see up here this is the issues tab, and so you can see for example, let's see, this is like this one's tagged as a feature request, right? So there's somebody asking for a new feature. There's other things in here like let's see, these are more technical types of things, requesting like changes to the pieces of code, and then also things like where can I download the binary, right? So these, we think about these as more project management types of things, because here in the where we go in the coding tab, these are we're writing code, we're editing code, things like that. Whereas in the project management, this may lead to code changes, but there's also kind of this question and answer and people asking, again, like where can I get this code and things like that, right? So much more project managerial types of things rather than the core work of coding. Okay, so that's GitHub in a nutshell, and open source in a nutshell. Now let's talk about the AI tool, right? So Copilot. Sorry, Maha, we go till still like basically another hour. This is what we got.
We've got a full almost a full hour, so you can use as
Great.
much time as you want, especially if the Q&A happens while you're speaking.
Perfect. Just keeping track of myself. Excellent. So Copilot was one of the first real uses of the technology that underlies ChatGPT. So this came out pre-ChatGPT, but was based on the same underlying foundational models, GPT-3, that were underlying the first version of ChatGPT, right? And so Microsoft/GitHub enter into this relationship with OpenAI. Really, it's kind of Microsoft makes this. It's sort of a fascinating history. It was actually like very, very prescient by Satya Nadella to make this relationship with OpenAI from the beginning. But then Microsoft was sort of like, okay, we have this access to this thing. We don't really know what to do with it. Where they're like nerdiest of the nerds in our giant organization. They're in GitHub, so let's see if anybody at GitHub wants to play around with this stuff, right? And so we wrote a teaching case on this kind of relationship and Microsoft and GitHub and Copilot, and it's interesting to kind of just see the history of they tried a few different things with this technology within GitHub before they actually narrowed into what became Copilot. And so what Copilot ends up being is, a standard kind of large language model that's specifically aimed at writing code, right? And so much like, if you're typing a text message, it will predict the next word for you. It's the same type of thing, except it'll predict the next chunk of code for you, right? And so, as most of you probably know, that's what LLMs are great at. They're great at predicting things and predicting chunks of text. And that's exactly what's happening here, except that text is just code, right? So what this ends up, looking like in practice is, say you want to write a Python file, a Python, piece of code that sends a tweet. All you have to do, so this person has, saved a file called send tweet. They start writing the function header, right? So define a function called send tweet with image, and this is what the human has done. And then Copilot takes over from there and suggests this whole block of code, right? And so if you haven't used this before, you can do this in, I think there's some add-ons for Stata and R and different things like that in our world. But this is obviously going to make things much faster, right? So much like any LLM, this code is not always 100% perfect. But now, the programmer doesn't have to spend the time actually writing out this, fairly basic kind of for a decent programmer type of code. Instead, they have to spend their time, basically like checking to make sure it's correct, right? But they don't have to actually write the code. And I don't think we don't talk about the acceptance rates too much in this study, but the acceptance rates are fairly high in that when the piece of code is suggested, the developers will usually keep it and maybe make one or two small tweaks, but will keep most of the code that is suggested by Copilot, right? And so as you can imagine, obviously that's going to speed people up. But then the question, as I've mentioned, that we're wrestling with is how does that then change how they allocate their time or allocate their tasks across all the tasks that they're doing, right? So that's what Copilot looks like. Any questions on the? I'll talk about the rollout of Copilot in just a second, but any questions on the technology itself? Great. So, so the way this tool rolled out is that in June of 2021, which seems like a lifetime ago at this point, but wasn't that long ago, they released what they called a technical preview, and so this was essentially, you could get a kind of early access to it, and you could play around with it and use it a little bit, and that was mostly like them trying to work out the kinks, right? So it was they called it a technical preview, and it was only rolled out to some folks, but then a year later, in June of 2022, they release it to the public, right? And so they release it in a few different ways, and we do what we can to kind of deal with that from an identification standpoint. But they release it, you can pay it for it, you can buy it, and it's like a monthly subscription fee. They do have a free trial, and then they release it to students essentially for free. And then what we'll focus on is that there's this top maintainer channel, and I'll dig into that in a minute. And we just recently got some data on the education channel as well, and have been able to use that as sort of a robustness check to kind of double check and show that there's some consistency in what we're finding across different groups. So we'll focus on this top maintainer access for free, and then think about the period of the study being essentially here's where the shock happens, and then after that we have 2 years worth of data, so we can kind of see these things as they evolve over time as well, and that's what we're looking at. And again, the main outcomes that we're looking at here are going to be coding and project management. So the way that the national experiment worked is that GitHub's goal was to reward top open source maintainers, and these folks that are doing lots of good for open source and for the world. And so their thought was we'll give free access to Copilot for the top X maintainers, right? And so we're not allowed to reveal what X is, but just think of it as some cutoff, as people that are based on an internal ranking process at the project or the repository level, so not the individual level. Projects or repositories that are above some threshold, the maintainers for that project get free access, and if they're below that threshold on the ranking, then they don't get free access, right? And so pretty straightforward, and kind of this leads into a classic RDD design for identification purposes. And the argument here is that the maintainers of the projects that were just above the cutoff are basically the same as those that are just below the cutoff, right? So they just missed it. Had their repository been slightly more popular or whatever, then they would have gotten access to it. But essentially, these people are the same, right? On in a narrow band around the cutoff. And so, an important thing with these types of studies is that you have to be able to say that there's no manipulation and people, playing games to get themselves just over the threshold. And so this is a conversation that happened, and I'll kind of zoom in on one of these about, GitHub Copilot and this top maintainer ranking program. But what this person says is, Copilot is available for free to verified students and popular open source projects. However, what GitHub defines as a popular open source project is sadly not expressly stated, right? And so the public doesn't really know, they know there's some sort of like cutoff and something, but they don't know how the ranking is done, and they don't know what the actual cutoff is. And then it's not public who gets access to Copilot, right? So it's, we can see, this is where the proprietary kind of work with GitHub and Microsoft comes in. We can see who ends up getting access, but it's not like a publicly viewable type of thing as to who gets access to Copilot or not. So from a kind of an econometric standpoint, this is sort of exactly what you want, because there's no ability to game this really by the maintainers, because they don't know what the ranking system is, and they don't know what the cutoff is, and then there's no kind of public display of who gets it and who doesn't get it, which is also helpful, because then it's it's less clear to those who don't get it that some other people have gotten it. So we have a pretty straightforward, regression discontinuity model where we look at those who are eligible, and we look at in the first stage we look at who gets access to Copilot, and then in the second stage we look at these activities that we're talking about, coding and project management, and we can think about this as just sort of at the individual level, but also the project level, and we've been doing some more robustness playing with both of those levels, but we'll be focused primarily on the individual who receives treatment or receives free access to Copilot as a result of being a maintainer on one of the projects that crosses this threshold, right? So the identifying assumption here is that any shift in the allocation of their work is going to be as a result of the introduction of AI, because again, on either side of this threshold, because they don't know where this threshold is or how the rankings are done, the people are pretty much very similar, right? And we'll do some additional things to try and dig into that and check around and play with that as well. So I sort of already talked about this, but just to give you a little more sense of the data itself, we see a maintainer I over time T, which is a week in the way we've aggregated it, just because not everybody works on every day or does stuff on every day, and so it's cleaner if we aggregate it to the week. So we look at their activity on a particular type of task, whether that's coding or project management, as a percentage of the overall activity that they're doing, and we end up with this balanced maintainer week panel where we have about 187,000 maintainers with 6 million observations, maintainer week observations. So that's kind of the broad setting of everything we have in the data. But then when we narrow into these bands on kind of just above and just below the threshold, and when these when these kind of treatments happened, we end up with a panel of about 7,000 maintainers with about 3,000 observations, right? So we're going from a very big sample of this, almost 200,000 maintainers to a much smaller sample, because the argument is that, again, when we're thinking about just being just above or just below the cutoff, those people are going to be more similar than, for example, people that are, number 1 versus number 1 million, right? And so again, the goal here is to use kind of the regression discontinuity to compare people that are similar to each other, but one gets the tool and one doesn't. So some descriptive stats, I'll point out one or two. This is across a year. This is how many days people are using Gen AI once they have the access to it. And so obviously, this is perhaps lower than we might expect, but this is something that I think over time we may see more adoption or more usage of Gen AI. But on average, the people that have access to it are using it about 10 days a year. Also think about the fact that they're not coding on every single day of the year, especially on open source. They have day jobs, they might have kids, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you think about it that way, this is a reasonable number. There is somebody here who's using Copilot every single day, but we do some Windsorization and things like that to make sure that they're not driving the outcomes here. And similarly, on any given day, here we're thinking about at the daily level. On any given day, people are almost 50% likely to do coding, or 25% likely to do some project management. And then these are what the other buckets are. These are kind of comments or reactions to other posts or other activities on GitHub. So these are more like, we could call these kind of social activities on GitHub, right? So we kind of, when we think about the two buckets that we're most interested in, coding and project management, there's these other kind of buckets of social engagement and interaction on the platform that we'll kind of use as our sort of baseline essentially. So this is looking at the kind of treatment, right? And so this is the orange are the people that are given the free access because they're above the threshold, and those that are in the blue are those that just missed the threshold, right? So we play around with the windows around the threshold, but we primarily use about 100 people that just get it and 100 people that just miss it. And again, in the scope of things that we're looking at, those people are pretty close to similar on a number of dimensions. And so this on the vertical axis here is the number of Copilot days used. And we can see this clear distinction that those that get the free access are going to use it much more, or substantially more, right? Noticeably more. Those that don't get the free access, or some of them are still using it. And you can think about this as those other channels for access, right? So the free trial or they paid for it or things like that. So think of this as, those who get the free access are more likely to use it, but those who don't get the free access are still able to use it, but are just less likely to actually use it. So that's kind of the setup for everything. So now we can get into some of the results. And so, thinking about hypothesis one, here we're talking about the direct sort of impact here. And so thinking about the sort of intent to treat, and we do this in a couple different ways, or the second stage least squares. What we end up seeing is that, this from a kind of the baseline from this is that there's an increase of about 6 percentage points in likelihood or amount of use of Copilot if you're in the free access group. And then what the result ends up being is that their coding increases by about 90 percentage points for those who get and use the free access to Copilot. But project management drops by about 170 percentage points for those, again, who get Copilot and actually use it, right? And so when we think about this, again, it's quite interesting because and this is as a percentage of all activities, but we do see this substantial increase in coding, but an even bigger, at least relative decrease in project management. So I think that hooray, support for hypothesis one. And again, this kind of notion that Copilot is making coding cheaper, and therefore we're likely to see more of it. I saw that there's some chats. Those are just people leaving. Okay, great. I didn't know if there were any questions or anything. So that's kind of the main result. I'll dig more into the other hypotheses and some robustness checks and some other things, but any questions or anything on that? Jiho?
Yeah, just for clarification, so the dependent variable here is the share, the proportion of like a specific type of work. It's not
Yes.
the amount of work they do, right?
Correct. It's the share of, yep, that's right.
Yeah, I was thinking if that's the case, then there are only like two types of task. One is coding and the other. Okay. In
Like,
that case,
so, yeah.
the increase in one task, does that like does that
Mechanically mean the
automatically,
other one has to fail.
mechanically
Yeah, yeah.
translate into
Yeah, so we've gone back and forth whether to do this in the kind of the relative or the concrete, like the total number or versus the relative, and it like it's because of the kind of spottiness of how frequently people do stuff in this world. It ends up being a cleaner measure to think about this as relative, right? But indeed, as a result of there are we'll say there's four types of activities you could kind of combine these two, but so it's not that they're mutually exclusive, right? It's there are yeah, it's not zero sum, right? Just because coding goes up doesn't mean project management has to go down, when we're thinking about this relatively, because there are some other types of activities as well. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yep.
Great. Go, Jan.
I tried to make sense of the project management. The title that you gave for that and how you measured it was like, was it these issues that were raised that they asked questions to the community? That was more or less how you captured it. You had
Yeah,
a
so
slide,
we have
but yeah.
I forget, is this yeah, here we go. Sorry. We've moved this to backup slides, but so here's a more granular view of these different buckets, right? So coding is creating something or copying a repository or actually editing the code, right? So that's what we consider coding. For project management, it's all about those issues as you were as we were alluding to there. So there's a whole bunch. I won't go super into detail about what all of these mean, but these are all, think of these as like, when I have like somebody asks a question or makes a request, I can assign that to somebody else, or I can close it, or I can create my own issues, or as kind of a to-do list type of thing, or I can edit things or like classify them, or actually merge in pull requests or do other things. Like, so these are all kind of the issue-based things they're certainly code adjacent, but they're more kind of managerial in our way of thinking about them. And maybe we should throw this slide back in the main deck, because I think it's and then again, there's these sort of other types of activities that they can do as well, thinking about like making comments about others' activities or reacting to to various things. These are I think some of these are simpler, but it's useful to have this kind of third bucket for exactly the reasons that Jiho was alluding to.
Yeah. I mean, the coding outcome is directly observable, of course. Even if you do it with AI or without AI, you see the code. And in the case of issue solving, when you say project management without knowing the back end of the story, I'm feeling like, okay, you need to coordinate things, talk to people, but it's basically about solving issues, solving problem solving here. And by actually asking these issues not to the community but to AI, the observations of these issues just decrease naturally, and which decreases indirectly the management of those projects. So I think it's a label issue that gives
so I'd be careful about that on sort of two dimensions. So and I think you're mostly right, but I want to clarify two things. So one is that because this is happening in a distributed context, it's not like these people are sitting in an office together having a conversation and like we can't see that, right? But the issues, they're not just like problems, they're also like to-do lists, and you can assign these out to people. So this is how project management happens in a distributed setting when there's not a ton of communication in other channels between people, right? And so it's more than just like question and answer type of thing. It is also like, we need somebody to do this. Okay, I'll assign that to you, right? Like that's a standard project management thing we think about, but that actually happens through the issues in this context, right? And so I think that's why, this context is actually very good for what we're trying to do, because we can see more of that granular project management than we would be able to in a more traditional, office or setting or other types of setting, right? And yes, like, there may be some things that happen outside of this, but for the bulk of kind of the managerial tasks, they happen through these issues and through things that are visible to us, the researcher, right? And then the other, what was the second thing you mentioned? Right. So the other thing to make sure that we're clear on is that Copilot, like Copilot's it's not the same as what we think of like ChatGPT or something like that today, that like can sort of answer questions. It's only doing this code prediction type of thing, right? And so from the project management side, yes, it can. So for example, if somebody asks me for a new feature, right, but doesn't give me the code for it, and I decide, okay, I want to do that, that's going to show up in both of these, right? Because I'm going to, I'm going to write the code, right, which is either going to show up as a pull request or a push. And then I'm going to close the issue, right? And so there we might see it as both, but Gen AI is not by itself. Like the Copilot is not kind of addressing these issues directly. It may help you write the code to address those issues, but you still have to sort of do the project management piece of it as well.
I mean, if you can just, I think, like the amount of number of issues going down. Okay, it doesn't answer, but just because it's predicting the next code I'm going to write, probably the number of issues raised could be declining. And that's kind of, I think, different than assigning these issues. So if controlling for the number of issues, the activity is going down, then it's really project management is done less.
So
that's the only comment.
If I recall correctly, I think we have something to look at that when we get into the more detailed. So hang on to that for a second. If I don't come back to it, it's somewhere in the backup slides. But
sure.
I think I'll get to that. Maha?
I'm wondering, theoretically, does this tell us something a little bit more interesting also about how coding and project management, as you've defined it here, issues, comments being deleted and so on, is there something with the use of AI that these things cannot be decoupled so much, which is why you see one going up and the other going down? Because I was wondering, if you write not better code, but if Copilot is writing visible, easy, straightforward code that doesn't require other issues to arise, maybe that's why you're getting this kind of, I'm just thinking theoretically, this could be far more interesting. I mean, like one of the implications from your study could be that actually it's the decoupling that we all often see in distributed environments of coding task and project management is actually not happening so much. In fact, they might be getting close. Because I was thinking more about service roles. You brought that up, right? That as academics, the more we publish, the more service we get. And sometimes the service we get is in teaching related administration, where they say, oh no, we can't hire an admin person, pure admin person, because it's got a little bit of teaching related to it as well. And that's where you come in. And that's how they get you, right? So basically, I was wondering if
that's interesting.
More of that happening.
Yeah, we haven't taught. Yeah, so I think like we haven't tried to track these tied directly to these, right? And so I think like that. So I will say that because we're getting the information directly from GitHub, we're dealing with some like privacy kind of filters basically. So we're seeing slightly more aggregate things than like if we just went to GitHub, the public version, and like downloaded the data and like saw things directly. So we haven't like tied these directly together. As I said, I think Manuel's in here, so he can say in the chat if I'm wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. But it's an interesting question because we see them as kind of as coexisting, right? As kind of synergistic on many dimensions, but perhaps they're more bifurcated. We might be able to look at that. GitHub has been an excellent partner in this, I will say, and has generally, when we ask for things, as long as they're not like too personally identifying, they'll share them with us. So that type of thing we might be able to get into. That's a good idea. Thank you. Great. So that's kind of, again, the headline effect here. And as I mentioned, we have this over 2 years post the shock. And so we can see, this is by quarter basically, right? So we can see that, the effect, dissipates a little bit. It, kind of spikes the third quarter after the program starts. But it never goes back to below where it was in the pre-period, right? And so, so when we think about, the long-term effects of this, at least over the course of 2 years, which is all we have data for at the moment, but that's also sort of almost all there's been, in terms of real time. It doesn't, these are permanent effects, right? So it's not something, yes, there's a big change in the short term, but there's a long lasting effect over the longer term as well. And we see the same thing, perhaps even more dramatically with project management, right? So this, this dip in project management certainly is at peak, around Q3 and goes down a little bit, but it's still quite different than the baseline, right? And so there's, this long lasting effect on these main results as well. And so actually, it's probably good we jumped into sort of the granular, measures of what's behind coding and project management, because when we think about hypothesis 2 and thinking about the mechanisms behind this, we're able to kind of look at the individual pieces of that. We'll do this in a few ways, but what makes up coding. And what we see in terms of changes, and so I'll sort of interpret this for you, is that the activities that are more I do them by myself and less engaged in any sort of collaborative nature are the things that really are driving that main increase, right? And so creating a repo is something I do by myself. I make a new repository, make a new project, and then pushing a commit is when I'm a maintainer and I want to make changes to the code by myself. That's what I do, right? Versus other types of coding activities where I'm engaging with other projects. So creating a pull request means I'm trying to add code to somebody else's repository and that I'm not a maintainer on, and that goes down a bit. And forking a repository, which is often a precursor to trying to add code to somebody else's repository, also goes down a little bit, right? So that jump in coding is driven by the two activities that are more autonomous. There are more things that I'm doing by myself as opposed to in conjunction with other people. And so when we think about that's basically what I said. And yeah, they go down a little bit for collaborative work and up for autonomous work. And on the project management side, we essentially see the same thing. For things that are things I can do by myself, those actually go up a little bit, right? So if I'm the maintainer, if I want to merge somebody's code in or closing an issue, these are things I don't really have to interact with other people. Yes, they're sort of, this is, I recognize this is a little wonky, but those are things that are more, I just do them by myself versus these other things that are driving that big negative effect that we found in the main results are things that, are directly engaging with other people, right? So subscribing to other people's things or reviewing pull requests, they're much more interactive and collaborative, and those are what's driving those going down is what's driving that negative effect in the main results. And we can also, we can think about, so these are kind of based on the types of activities, but we can also think about this in the number of collaborators that are involved in projects that we're working on, right? So this is on the coding side. So think about, the baseline of kind of 0 here is what the number of collaborators on average that people who don't get free access to Copilot are doing. And what happens is after, when the folks who get free access to Copilot, they start working on projects that have fewer and fewer people on them, right? So these are the granular level activities, but these, even the more kind of collaborative activities are only happening in places where there's fewer and fewer other collaborators, right? So these are like the drop in the number of collaborators. And likewise, on the project management side, we see essentially the same thing. That for most of the activities that people are doing, they're on the project management side, they're doing it in a context where there's fewer and fewer other people, right? So they're doing this in smaller projects with smaller amounts of people. And so again, it's just a second way of thinking about, this drop in collaborative behavior and increase in more autonomous and solo, or at least smaller project type of behavior, smaller number of collaborators behavior. Good. So that was hypothesis 2. So hypothesis 3, we kind of used a similar model and thinking about the changes and that can be behind the driving the primary results, and thinking about exploration versus exploitation. We'll measure this in a couple of ways as well. So what we see here think of these as new to me projects, right? So old projects are projects I've worked on before, and have interacted with before. New projects, they might be old to the world, but they're new to me, and I've never interacted with that project before, right? And so what we see is a clear increase in interactions with projects I've never interacted with before, and much smaller in terms of coefficient, but a noticeable decrease in my activities on older projects, right? And so when we think about, again, here's the definitions of those, but that's again consistent with this idea of doing more exploration, more things I've never done before, and less exploitation. And this goes, Bilge, you were asking sort of about this. This is one of the ways we measure this. We also, as I mentioned at the top, measure this in thinking about programming language exposure. And so here we can think about the folks that are eligible for the free Copilot compared to the folks that are not, start expanding the number of programming languages that they've interacted with. So that's kind of what this is showing, is that those who have free access to Copilot start using more programming languages, including languages they haven't used before.
And is there, I mean, I don't know why, but I was trying to think this through, why this would happen. Is it potentially because people get bored because now that they've got a tool to write the code for them, they look for other things to do, or is it perhaps let's say I am a developer and I want to gain reputation quickly, then maybe I use, Copilot for other projects and become a maintainer. So I'm trying to think, is this why they explore? And explore might not mean doing new things or being extremely creative, but trying to build reputation elsewhere quickly. Or I'm just trying to think very much in the open source world what this actually implies.
Yeah, and that would be consistent also with this finding on the new projects versus the old projects, right? So I don't have a great answer for that. I mean, I will say, as a former computer scientist, former programmer, like, once you sort of know the basic structures of programming, you can jump from one language to another, but you're going to know one or maybe two languages best, right? And those are going to be your baseline, right? But maybe, for example, and this is speculation, but there's a project that you've always wanted to contribute to, but it's written in a language that you're not really familiar with, and so now that Copilot is here, you're better able to do that, right? Because you know how to program, and you know how to write a function header and some of the basics, but you're not an expert in that language, right? And so that would be my speculation as to kind of what might be happening here. So that would be, again, speculation, but would certainly be consistent with this story, that you want to go help some other project or contribute to some project that you've known about, but you just don't write in that language, and now Copilot has made it much easier for you to write in that new language, right? Again, a bit of speculation. We'll have to think about if there's anything we can do to test that and check that better. Jiho?
Yeah, if you go to the previous table about the new and old projects, so the V here is the counter project, right? The counter of each type of project that the developer is engaged in.
Log count +1, but yes,
So
essentially that.
I was wondering, if you can actually look at how the number of activities, more granular activities like pull, push, and reactions,
In the new
those kind of
projects?
things in the new project and as well as in the old project. So I can imagine that if you it could be that you are now working on fewer old projects, but if you increase the number of activities that you're doing in that project, then can you say actually the exploitation increases?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? And that would be consistent with the discussion earlier. We have not looked into that. I think that we can. We'll have to double check the granularity of exactly how the data was sliced and things like that. But I think we could look into that to see kind of are the activities in the new projects different than the activities in the old projects, right? And the way that they kind of interact with them. Yeah. No, that's a good idea. I don't have an answer for that, but it's a good idea and probably something we can take a look at.
I was thinking that might answer Bill Gann's previous question about why if the cost of doing something dropped, when why
Yep.
doesn't exploitation actually increase? So
Yeah, indeed. And so that's, yeah, I mean, and that's right. And, I think, again, this we argue that a lot of this will generalize, but some of these things, again, like I said, with I'm about to show the results for the ability, right? Like it's been shown that like that sort of depends on context sometimes, right? As to whether AI is going to help the lower ability or the higher ability, but and it may be similar for exploration and exploitation, but we may be able to look in that a bit more. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking the same, because this measure is basically determining exactly the framing. And can't you look at the like interaction for starting new projects with the new language? That might be a better measure maybe for exploration, because I'm starting new projects means I'm getting more productive actually, right? So otherwise,
well, I mean, it
like
again,
new projects on
productivity.
what? No, that's the question. New projects on
Yes,
what?
yes, exactly.
Or
So
or using what? Like that's, I think, the
yep,
more creative
yep.
side.
Yeah, no. Agreed. I think, and again, I don't know that we have the exact cut of the data to look at that, but we probably could get it, right? Because again, that's like, just a permutation of the data that we do have. So, yeah,
And
no, that's a good idea.
as a general feedback, like because this whole ambidexterity discussion is on the organizational level, whereas you're kind of highlighting individual level gains.
Yeah,
And do you
that's
really
true.
benefit from framing it this way? I mean,
It's a
what is
good
the value
question.
added? What is the value added for using this very established organizational? I mean, it's great. There's a lot of work coming out. I see on AMR on organizational learning with AI, etc. But what
Sure.
is it that you're contributing in the
No,
organizational level? Maybe that's kind of
it's
interesting.
It's a fair point, and I
Yeah.
think yes, like the bulk of my work is at the organizational level, and so that's how I tend to think. But fair point that much. I will say there is some. I won't go all the way back, but some of that literature is on the individual level. But you're right that
Yeah.
most of it is more on the organizational level, and that's we're mixing our level of analyses. No, that's a fair point. Which we should probably refine a little bit to ensure because again, I think there is some work on the individual level on that so but mentioning the organizational work may be modeling our theoretical like arguments. Yeah, nope, that's helpful. Thank you. Good. So one last thing on the exploration. So we take this piece, especially with a grain of salt, but we look at Stack Overflow did a developer survey. They do it every couple of years, and so we can actually look at. And this kind of goes back to where Maha's point, but we can look at the languages that people are entering, and we can weight them based on the average salary based on this developer survey of the people who code in that language, right? So you can imagine there's some languages that are higher in demand, and so people are going to get a higher salary if they're coders in that language versus other languages that nobody cares about. So it's a lower a lower salary for people in those languages. We don't take a position on like whether that's right or wrong. Like that's just how it is kind of revealed in the marketplace, right? But what is interesting is that we see not only I just showed these they're expanding and doing more programming languages, but they're also moving to programming languages that pay more, right? And so to Maha's, I sort of forgot about this when I was answering your question, but another reason they may be doing this is that I'm a programmer in X, I've seen this survey or know that other languages may pay better, and this may be an opportunity for me to learn how to and start coding in a language that's more profitable, right? Again, this is a little this is very back of the envelope, right? So we can sort of do like a macro level impact of Gen AI, very back of the envelope. But if we think about this, we kind of do some calculations like that for the average person in this, the bump would be about $1,600 in their salary per year. If they had to pay for Copilot, it's about $10 a month, so $120 a year. So there's this kind of net potential benefit at the individual level for $1,500. If we aggregate that across the 300,000 developers, that we see on GitHub, there's this kind of potential for about a $500 million like market boost, right? Obviously, this is not general equilibrium, and so like prices would adjust and all these types of other things. But this is one of the critiques we always get for this type of stuff is like, where's the dollar figures? How can we think about this? But it at least gives us somewhere to anchor on kind of thinking about the market level impacts of these types of tools, right? Is that we may see the ability to increase people's wages and things like that as a result of Gen AI. Again, very back of the envelope. Good. Okay. We're doing okay on time. We'll kind of go through the final hypothesis, and I'll show you a couple of robustness checks. I won't show you everything, but when we think about the ability of the programmers, this is on how much it changes their coding, right? And so we can see that for the lower ability folks, and we do ability. I don't have time to go deep into these, but we measure ability based on kind of 4 different measures, and everything's fairly consistent, right? So centrality to projects, the achievements that they've gotten on GitHub, the number of followers that they have, and how long they've done that on GitHub, right? So all kind of noisy proxies for ability, but all very consistent across the board. That those with higher ability based on these, on these different dimensions, are impacted less. On the coding side, their coding increases less than those with lower ability. And actually, you can see even the ones that have the lowest tenure, right? Tenure is kind of the biggest one here, where those who are kind of youngest or newest to this game are their behavior is being changed the most. And likewise, or with project management, we again see that those with high ability, think of kind of zero change being out over here. Those with high ability are, they're dropping their project management activities, but not nearly as much as those with low ability, right? And so, both high ability and low ability are being impacted by this, but it's the low ability folks on both the increase in coding and the reduction in project management that are really, the ones that are being affected the most, right? Which again, consistent with most of the literature on AI, of it helping those with low ability or changing the behavior of low ability more than those with high ability. Although actually, now that even just kind of saying that, right, when we think about most of these studies have been on productivity, we can imagine that the low ability folks have more room to move on a productivity scale than the high ability folks. Like the high ability are already sort of maxed out or close to maxed out, and things like that. Whereas here, when we're thinking about kind of the nature of work, it may not necessarily be as as intuitive that the low ability folks would be the ones to have the biggest change in their allocation of tasks and things like that. Bill Hunt?
I buy this argument. I think it's quite expected in that sense. I'm just trying to make sense of what low ability means here, because you told us like these are the group that are very close to the cutoff point. So I expect them to all be kind of in a way high ability folks. What is the low ability really?
Fair point. So keep in mind that the treatment, the assignment of free Copilot happens at the project level. But then our analysis happens at the individual level, right? So, many projects only have one maintainer, so that that's sort of the same thing. But some projects have more than one maintainer, so the project may be above, but there may be some people that are maintainers on that project that are lower on these ability metrics, right? Or you can even think about there's definitely examples of people that for example, like tenure, right? Like there's some folks that show up, write a super useful package and like immediately, right? And so they're just going to be on the platform for less time, but it turns out their project is super impactful, and so they end up crossing that threshold, right? And that would be sort of similar with followers, right? If you're even if you have a low number of followers, your project may be impactful, but it's buried deep in the dependency chain, so nobody knows that you're like the person who made that, right? And so I fully agreed that when we say ability here, it's kind of relative ability, but that these are all maintainers of projects, so they most like, and for the ones that cross the threshold, like their project has hit some level of popularity, wide use, impact, however we want to think about it. And so yes, these aren't like the super junior kind of folks. But I will say, if I have a second, I'll show you the results for when we look at the students and the free access that happened there. We have to do things a bit different because the way that was rolled out was a bit different. But we still kind of find similar, at least high level impacts, right? And so there you can at least imagine, the students are, there's still going to be a range of ability within students, but they're, all of them are younger for the most part, right? And so we can think about that as well.
The other thing, if I may add, we are comparing here the people that got unlimited Gen AI access versus the ones that still had access, but it was 60-day limited. No, it was limited access. You're comparing limited. It's not like no access versus access, but it's limited access versus unlimited access.
A slight tweak on that. There were a couple of other ways there were a couple other ways you could get access, right? So it's the people that got free access versus the ones who may have gotten access some other way, either through the trial or they could have paid for it, right? And so this is kind of a nudge type of thing, right? Like you're more likely to start using Gen AI if you get it for free, and free for permanence, as you're kind of saying, or unlimited, versus somebody that's has to pay for it, or has only has it for 60 days, right?
I'm saying this because maybe that could also explain the difference between the high versus low ability. The high guys will also find other ways to make up for these differences. So you will see little difference between the high group versus there will be a big jump maybe in low group. So low group will maybe have also lower income. I mean, a couple of other things that can explain this difference then.
No, it's a good point. And
still ability, but
Manuel just put in the chat, thank you, Manuel, to remind me, it's not unlimited access. It's once you kind of cross that threshold, you get free access for a year, and then you get reevaluated after another year. So if your project kind of slips below that threshold, then you would lose that free access after a year, right? Thanks, Manuel. Cool. Okay. I know we have a little bit of time left, so a few last things. There's been this, concern. Open source is not like proprietary, and like would the effects be different for within a firm, for example? So we split out people that have a clear firm affiliation, but they're working on open source code, and compare those to folks that don't have a clear firm affiliation and are more likely to be working on open source, in their spare time or on their own. And we only see a tiny little difference in the effect on coding and product management, right? So for the folks that are working on that are affiliated with a firm, their coding actually goes up slightly more than the folks that are not affiliated with a firm, after with access to Copilot or free access to Copilot. And conversely, we see that their project management for those that are working at a company or likely working on behalf of a company, their project management goes down slightly less than those folks with that are not as affiliated with a firm. So this is, I will admit, this one's a little bit fuzzy, but it at least starts to give some more evidence that these results are generalizable to within what we could expect to happen within a company if a Copilot type tool was rolled out to the employees. So a whole bunch of robustness checks on kind of the model and some other ways of thinking about the ranking and things like that. I'll quickly mention the kind of quality effects. So Maha mentioned the word quality. This is something we've gotten beaten up with from reviewers and other things. Is that is the quality here actually better? I think this is. So we do have some basic level evidence to show that at a minimum, quality coming from using Copilot doesn't get worse, and it probably gets slightly better, right? And so this isn't the main push of the study, but we always get these types of questions about quality, right? Like if they're using Gen AI, is it just writing garbage code, but like they're committing it, and so it's just reducing the overall cost, quality of open source code. We have evidence to say that that's not true, right? So the number of critical vulnerabilities falls, interactions with the code increases, and and we see improved maintainer abilities, and so we again, how you measure quality of code is like there's a whole literature on how to do that, but at least with some measures we can argue that the quality of the code doesn't go down, and it probably gets better a little bit. And then we also, I mentioned the student access. I'll show that real quick, but so what happens with students is different. They just kind of at one point flip a switch, and all the students get access to Copilot for free. And so here we look at it in sort of a diff and diff, and we compare students to everybody else. Which is, that's messy, and there's all sorts of things, issues with that. But just again, it's kind of a confirming what we saw before. After students get access, we see exactly the same thing, right? So in a different pool of people, a different type of trying to, a different measurement path. We see this again, that coding goes up, again, in this kind of relative measure, and project management goes down, right? So again, this isn't kind of the primary focus of the empirics here, because there's a whole bunch of messiness here, but good that the story is consistent, right? And so again, we see after students have this free access, their coding goes up and their project management goes down, consistent with what's happening with the maintainers. And then one last one I'll show is we also, so all the main results are using just the regression discontinuity. We've also done some propensity score matching, as well as using differences in discontinuities, which is kind of melding a diff and diff with an RDD. And everything here is again consistent. The coefficients change, a little bit, but we still see this increase in coding and this decrease in project management across the board. So with that, I'll wrap up. So, our goal with this study is really to think about, the nature of work itself, as opposed to just productivity, which, again, lots of great work on thinking about the impact of AI and Gen AI in particular on productivity. But, we're trying to push the boundaries and go beyond that and think about how it actually changes the jobs that people do. Just again, to kind of highlight the findings, we, find that coding goes up, project management goes down, and we're arguing that the mechanisms are driven by this increase in more solo work, autonomous work, and decrease in collaborative work, combined with this increase in exploration and decrease in exploitation. And then finally, again, we see across a number of ways of measuring ability, the impact on both coding and project management is greater for folks with lower ability, with the caveat that, these aren't like super low ability folks. Although again, with the student example, we may have some more supportive evidence for that. The treatment effect remains after 2 years in this real world setting. And again, this back of the envelope calculation would say that there's kind of at least $500 million of labor market potential impact here as well. And so we, that in the end, we think Gen AI can positively impact this public good, open source software, help mitigate kind of the linchpin problem in distributed work context, and potentially flatten organizational hierarchies as well. I think again, question on this first bullet is to if we're making open source less collaborative, is that a good thing, a bad thing? To Maha's point, like it's sort of less collaborative than we think it might be anyways. But this is pushing it further in that direction, but allowing those key maintainers to spend more of their time doing what they want to do and less of their time doing what they don't want to do. So that's it. The QR code links you to the paper. It's up on SSRN. We're adding a few more things, a few more of the robustness checks, some of the quality stuff and things like that aren't in the public version, but we're hoping to update the public version within the next couple of weeks. So thank you all for having me. It's great. Thanks for all the questions and the feedback, and looking forward to talking in the future.